cozy snow globe of a day. We get to look out the windows and see that it is snowing, which makes us feel like it's the holiday season, so that's good.
Are you gonna break into song?
I have a song ready, you know.
It just seemed like we were heading down that.
We're going there, you never know, December.
Musical.
You know this.
This agenda has the main event, which is Charles and Leslie are gonna be talking about the transit funding allocation policy. But first, a few business items, and I'm actually gonna take care of the non-consent and other business items first, and then we'll get to the main information item. This is a committee of the whole, but because we have some actions that are timely, we're always able to have some business items at a committee of the whole meeting. So with that, unless anybody disapproves or objects, we'll take that agenda as approved. But there are minutes from our meeting on November 6th, 2024. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Move approval.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion, corrections, additions? All right, hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, those minutes are approved. Then we have a non-consent business item, which is coming from our community development
Mr.
area.
Chair. So,
Thank you. Is there a second?
District one.
Second.
Oh, do you want to report on it?
Is there any
Oh,
report?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Report.
Well, you know, I just respond when Councilmember
I'm okay
Johnson.
voting without a report.
Councilmember Bento.
I'll be brief. Mr. Chair, council members, business item 2024-310 Southwest, or same week, excuse me. Is a same week business item for a parks acquisition award to Three Rivers Park District for property along the West Mississippi River Regional Trail. We are bringing this forward the same week to help Three Rivers Park District meet their targeted closing date in December. I will skip the summary. You can read more information about it in the material you received with the agenda. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I propose that the Metropolitan Council approve a grant of up to $1,280,000 from the Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund to Three Rivers Park District to acquire 4 parcels totaling 6.9 acres located at 15520 Lawndale Lane North in Dayton, Minnesota for the West Mississippi River Regional Trail. 2, authorize the Executive Director of Community Development to execute the grant agreement and restrictive covenant on behalf of the council. 3, require that Three Rivers Park District resolve access issues with the property owner before acquiring the property. And 4, require that if Three Rivers Park District is able to sell the newer home at a public auction, the proceeds must first be used to cover stewardship costs that exceed their required match. Any remaining proceeds may be used for the betterment of Three Rivers Park District's share of the regional parks and trails system.
Second, sorry.
Thank you, thank you. Any discussion? All right, hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, I'm glad we did that. There's also an other business item, 2024-334, Equity Advisory Committee appointment. It is my distinct honor to appoint Dr. Tyrone Carter to the EAC to replace Councilmember Chai Lee. And I actually have talked to both, and thank you, Chai, for your service, and also Councilmember Carter for your willingness and interest, and that you have been attending these meetings. It is for numbers of months. It is fitting that we actually have to approve this and confirm that your appointment, because now you will actually be able to vote on the committee. That's important. So with that, is there I move that. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion, questions? All right, hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thanks so much. Well, and thank you all for allowing us to get those business items done this week. before the holiday. And now we have Charles Carlson, and I believe we're gonna also have at some point Leslie Caderas and others to really talk about something we've been talking about and we're gonna hear more of, and we'll have be able to take an action later in December. But this whole idea of transit funding allocation is one that is really critical for our years ahead. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, council members. Charles Carlson, Executive Director, Metropolitan Transportation Services. Happy to talk through a important topic as the chair noted. We'll talk about some of the background that's led into development of a new funding allocation policy that really this is part one of a policy development process that will go into next year. But part one is really the foundation for it. We'll talk about the background for that. We'll talk about this part one policy in a little more detail and the next steps in terms of adopting, but then ultimately building upon this policy. So by way of background, an updated transit funding policy does a few things for us. One is that it reflects some state law changes that have taken effect in recent years. It improves transparency in how we allocate funding. I think especially for federal transportation funding that comes to us for transit purposes, we point to, right now we don't even have it in any policy. We just point at a business item that the council adopted in 2001 that is a little, we're still gonna point at that business item because those remain the principles until we've replaced them with a more robust policy, which again we'll be developing. But having greater transparency, I think, will help us have better coordinated transit service by really being clear about how we allocate funding. It also unifies some policy direction across a number of different transit funding sources. So the policy this will replace is only about state funding, and so we're broadening it to include other funding sources. It also sets the basis for more updates. So a robust and enduring allocation of sales tax funding. The use of that funding is not provided yet, but we're setting the basis for it. We're looking at potential allocation changes for federal funding, recipient relationship changes with providers in the region. How we purchase and own fleet in the region may change with other providers. That's not yet ripe for adoption in policy, but this helps us begin the path toward other conversations and further work. Right now we have a robust regional bus system where we have a growing metro system. So these are the services that are sustained by our transit funds in the region now. But really just the beginning of a regional and significant metro system and including 3 lines that we will open next year. So this metro system continues to expand and grow. Plans and development around these lines are continuing. What this policy does is helps sustain the funding for the operations and capital maintenance of this plan. So that work continues. Within this plan and within the region's transportation policy plan, we have a number of different transit funding sources, and I'll just mention them at a high level here. Federal funds for transit comprise what we expect over the next 25 years to be about 13%. It's a bigger share in earlier years because that's when we have major capital program projects identified. That could continue, they're just not yet in our plan. So the federal funds in the plan for light rail build out, for example, they're front loaded. We expect them to happen sooner than later in the next 25 years. It's not to say that there couldn't be additional funds and additional projects. They're just not yet in our plan because we haven't identified them. So that could continue. But what is reflected in the plan, what will continue are the formula funds we receive annually. We use these for things like bus replacement.
Sorry, we keep missing each other.
Okay.
We use them, we have regional solicitation dollars that are allocated for transit uses. We have at times congressionally directed funds for specific projects. So federal funds comprise a small share, but a very large share in the near term as we're continuing our build out with capital investment grant projects and the like. The state is a major funder of transit, about 40% of the revenues we expect. The largest by far share of that comes from the motor vehicle sales tax. That is constitutionally dedicated for a portion for transit service and comes to the region by statute. We also receive state general fund appropriations and capital investment from the state and other sources of revenue. A couple years ago, the local share, and this now is a regional share, would have been a very small number. Now it's a much larger number. Also around 40% comes to us from the largest source being the new transportation sales and use tax. We'll talk more about that in the subsequent slide. But this also includes a transit debt service levy that the council issues in the transit levy district that we use to support bonding that we fund transit maintenance capital projects with, as well as county transportation taxes that will be used for capital projects and really the primary use of those for transit will be for capital project build out, no longer for operations. And we'll talk about that in another slide as well. And then finally, we have operating revenue. This is fair revenue, advertising, interest income, other sources of revenue. So the big picture is really concentrated on state and local funding, although there is federal funding that is important to our service delivery as well. In 2023, the state passed a significant piece of legislation, a number of significant pieces of legislation, but one is a transportation bill that continued some important elements, but also established new and transformative change to how the region approaches transit funding. First of all, an important piece of this is what didn't change. The state did continue base appropriations for metro mobility operations and for light rail and commuter rail funding. So that is state general fund appropriations that continued for 2023 and 2024, state fiscal 24 and 25, that continue funding our services from the state general fund. They also provided the council authority to issue transit debt, which would be then supported by our property levy. Those pieces continue. Those are important pieces of the transit funding base that we're building on. A second piece that was really important in 2023 was continued state investment in transit. So the state identified over $130 million of capital investment from general fund appropriations, from state cash bill, as well as a bonding bill that advanced the Blue Line LRT, the arterial BRT program, and also made investment in the Metro Red Line through a station improvement in Apple Valley, as well as $3 million for planning and advancement of the Highway 55 and 169 bus rapid transit lines. So the state in 2023, despite new revenue that we'll get to next, remained a significant investor in the capital build out of the metro system. So that continued as well. And then third, a sustainable new revenue source. So something that had been sought for many years was assembled and passed as a new 3/4 cent sales tax for metropolitan transportation purposes. Collections began in October of 2023. This generates around $450 million a year, which is a significant share of funding for the region's system. 17% of that funding goes directly to metro area counties, and we'll get into the county role in this in a bit, but a portion of the funds, I think as you know, goes directly to counties. The remainder, 83%, comes to the council. 5% of that is for active transportation purposes that TAB defines. So the TAB has been hard at work over the last year or so identifying potential uses. A pilot slate of projects was identified in the process of the 2024 regional solicitation. So these funds will be put to use while broader policy and approach and integration with the regional solicitation or not is developed as consideration by TAB. So that work will be continuing as we evaluate the regional solicitation process over the next year. The other 95% comes to the Council for Transit Operations, Maintenance, and Capital Preservation. This is really important funding for us because it did a couple things, and we'll build upon these last two bullets in the next slides. It addressed a long-standing structural operating deficit that we would have been facing going into this next session with a $200 million deficit that needed to be addressed. So it resolved that. It also reshaped how we fund the operating costs in the system that we'll talk about next. So again, the 2023 bill provides sustainable transit funding. It resolved that structural operating deficit that had been filled for many years through one-time fixes. One-time fixes from the state, COVID relief funds patched up the budget during the last few years, but really those funds are pretty well expended at this point, and we would be facing this structural deficit. What that means for us is $200 million annually that we don't need to resolve some other way. That over time adds up to about $8 billion that comprises about a third of the sales and use tax revenues. So the largest and first use of this funding is to resolve that deficit, which is great news. It's great to have that resolved going into the next many years. The other piece that it does is it replaced the former state share, the state obligation to the expanded metro system. So we receive and have continued to receive about $33 million annually for the existing system. What this did is established a use for a funding source for the future lines. So that would be about $100 million annually, or about $3 billion over the course of time, as this system phases in, and would represent about 15% of the sales tax. The other thing that this funding provides is that it funds the upkeep of the system. So very important to keep the system in a state of good repair. It allows that and actually requires it by law after use of federal funds and regional transit capital funds. So it resolves what had been an unresolved issue in terms of how we sustain the light rail and BRT system over time. The other big piece that this did for us was replace county funding for operating and potentially for capital maintenance in state law. So rail and BRT operating costs are no longer the responsibility of metropolitan counties. It replaced what had been a 50 to 100% share, depending on the line, for operating costs and in some cases capital maintenance. Metro counties then may reinvest those savings into other transportation system improvements. So the amount of that is about $50 million a year right now. As the system continues to grow, that would amount to about $150 million by the time that the planned system is built out. A significant amount of funding of $5 billion over 30 years, about a quarter of the sales tax is freeing counties to make other investments in transportation. In addition to that, the counties, as I mentioned earlier, are also receiving 17% of the sales tax funds. So in addition to that $5 billion, there's another $100 million or so annually that the counties will collect and may use for other purposes. Roughly 41% of that goes, by law, is directed toward the primary use being active transportation. Another 41% primarily for roadway reconstruction that does not include expansion. And then 17% may be used on transit, on complete streets, or on climate offset projects. So significant investment in the region that counties will be able to make.
Charles, can I just hammer 2 points from your last two slides? From the perspective of how council members, as you're helping with these conversations in communities going forward, there's a couple of themes we hear a lot, and these slides break it down really well. But at the base level, the last slide showed of the new sales tax coming to the Met Council for transit, About 50% of it covers what had been an operating deficit year over year over year over year and growing. Plus the idea of supporting the state's obligation of operating the metro system. So I think it's really important when people say you got all the new money. We did get new money, we're grateful for the money, but let's also be clear what the new money did, and 50 cents of every dollar went to sustain an existing system in a way that in the past, we were cobbling it together credit card by credit card at a time. When you find yourself in spaces, I always start with that. We gotta take half the money off the table when we talk about the future and think about how important it is though to shore up. On this slide, the other conversation that comes up a lot in conversation with our local partners, there is a bit of, these things are complicated bills, they take time. There's still this habitual nature on, but we pay operating costs on lines along with the council, so we need to talk about every last detail operationally. And it's this piece to remind everyone, no, we don't actually share in the operating costs anymore. We pay the dinner check when it comes at that point. And the money you were using for that is now available to have conversations around partnership of how could we invest that in ways that further enhance the system for the region's residents. And that's something where, whether it's a county that's already been operating lines or counties that are prospectively thinking about the future, there still is a bit of a learning curve there where it's like, we don't have any money for transit. It's sometimes a line we will hear moving around, and we want to say, well, where were you going to pay the bill for the operating costs until 2023? We know you were planning for it. Don't forget that money is now there. And so, to the extent possible, as you're thinking about the future and planning and expanding the pie and where we go, I wanted to just really hammer home those 2 points that you lay out really nicely on these slides.
I'll walk through this chart because it kind of tells the story, but I recognize there's a number of lines on it that we need to track. But it is, it really, I think for me, and maybe for you, after we talk through it, explain some things. So key assumptions on the right side. So this chart assumes that the state base and capital funding continues. I mentioned in 2023 it continued. This future-looking report, and this is from a legislative report that we submitted last month, that lays out the next 10 years of what's happening with transit investment and transit funds in the region. So one, we're assuming the state continues to pay for, and the counties continue to pay for the capital build-out. Second, we do have a placeholder number that represents about a 10% increase in bus service in the region. So there is some base system growth as well. It may not be exactly that number. It might be some other capital projects that are needed instead, but that's a number in the report as we continue our planning. And then finally, that no sales tax funding is being spent on the initial build out. We're using it only for operating and capital maintenance. Counties, the state, and federal funds would pay for the initial build out. So those are kind of the three key assumptions that go into how this fund grows and changes over time. So within the chart then, the green line on this chart shows the total revenue. The blue shows the operating expenditure, and then the gray shows the capital expenditure of sales tax funds. So when we put this all together, you see what translates to an orange line that is the fund balance. So the fund initially is growing as the early revenues exceed the operating costs. So that's good. We're building a fund balance even as we're addressing what has been a capital backlog in the early years. So you see the gray capital expenditure starts up kind of high and then drops for a while. As that drops, the fund balance, the bank balance of the sales tax grows and actually grows to a little over $500 million. It would be very tempting to think, oh, there's a lot more money than you need in this. In a few years, in just 5 years, you'll have $500 million in the bank. Couldn't we use that for something else? Tempting to think that, the answer is no, because what we're required to do with this funding is continue to operate the system that we're building. And you can see that the blue, the operating expenditures, that gap between the green line and the blue line closes and closes and closes as our operating uses grow and grow and grow as we're building up the system. What's also happening is that we're making capital replacement. So beginning in the early 2030s, we need to replace our light rail. In a couple phases, we need to replace our light rail fleet, including from this funding source. So to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So as those operating obligations are becoming mature, as our capital replacement obligations come due, we would be drawing down the fund balance and actually using most of it by the end of the mid-2030s. So we will have, acknowledging here, we will have a near-term fund balance, but within a decade, we'll have pretty well spent that from upcoming obligations. And then from there on, you see that under number 5, the developed system uses most of the sales tax revenue just for operations. So we'd be looking at continued ways to sustain and fund the capital maintenance of the system at that point. I'll note, sales tax is not the only source of capital maintenance funding. Federal formula funds, RTC, those remain important sources. Those are continuing as well. We'd be continuing to balance the system moving forward. This is why we want to, and the policy proposes and we'll get to it, a 25-year time horizon. What happens in the 15 years after this is what we're continuing to develop, continuing to explore, and want to report and have inform how we allocate funds and for what purposes, because we need to take a long-term look to ensure that this is a sustaining and sustainable ongoing funding source. With that, Mr. Chair, that's the financial overview. The next piece really gets into how we translate that into funding policy, but I might just pause briefly to see if there's any immediate funding background or what did the law do questions before we transition into the policy approach.
Great presentation of those graphs, really make it clear. Any questions? Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's not a question, it's a comment, of course. So, no, I just wanna make sure everyone knows, this has been being worked on for months and months, and there are pages and pages and spreadsheets, and Charles and Leslie and Ryan have done a really nice job of taking all of this and projecting it out and figuring out what's really going to happen and where the money is going, and trying to make it relatable. So, definitely if you have comments on it being relatable and how we can communicate about it, let us know, but kudos to all of these guys.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, I really appreciate being on the policy work group. This presentation was that just Thursday that we got this? Life is going too fast for me right now. But, and I was saying, this again will be another thing that goes into my box, that if a legislator asks me anything, I think when money gets appropriated, the problem is solved. And yes, this is awesome, but when the out years are what we have to always keep an eye on. And I don't know, I'm still newish to this, 6 years in, but I don't know if we've ever done this kind of analysis and tried to align our funding and get good policy behind it the way we're doing now, because I understand this more now than I ever have, and I think it's sequential for me. So I just wanna thank Charles, the team, and Deb for really making this very clear, and hopefully people can read this and understand it.
And Mr. Chair, I will say we have done this before, but it was really with a bunch of red numbers
All
and
red
boxes
flags.
and flashing lights and not good things. So we're in a very different position now. I used to carry around the spreadsheets and the charts that were all red numbers that did not look good. So once again, thank you to the legislature for the transportation.
But really also, really important point that comes out of this is that the legislature passed a robust bill that helps us on the margin, but our existing revenues that were in place continue to be significant and an important part of this overall kind of business model. Did you have something? No. Any other questions? Right.
Mr. Chair, just maybe 2 last points on this piece, and thanks to everyone who's been a part of weighing in. I kept forgetting what tonight's agenda was because I already thought we had presented this here because of how many times we talked about it. It was hard to remember. So I think that's a good sign of where we're getting to. We will work to get this in front of the legislature this year as well because it's an important baseline setting for the organization. The 2 things I wanted to raise, this clearly establishes from the council perspective, I think, a trustee function, particularly over the coming decade plus, of how to help ensure that resources are protected so that we are not a system in crisis or out of sustainability again. And that's comes out loud and clear as we look at this. And I wanna state that that's a clear thing here is how we message that, how we talk about it, how we think about that. We need your help in that. And not everyone will believe everyone here. They'll think that staff are hiding money or we're just squirreling it away. I mean, that's just the natural way this stuff works. Your role in that is so important to being able to do the things you're about to, we talk about. The policy is one big piece of framing it. The other thing is, as an organization, I think it's important to also put a mirror on ourselves and realize we've been an organization living in starvation mode for a very long time. And it's a significant culture shift to move to an organization with resource. And so how do we lean into things? How do we thoughtfully evaluate? When you have no money, it's almost the same as having unlimited money, because it's like money becomes secondary. Now we have to live in both a constrained world, but a world of possibility. And I would ask that you all help us too on the strategic end of continue to both lean into that and think about what that means. We're working through that together, and I want to give kudos to Charles and Leslie for setting tones with their teams like that and all the finance staff across this organization. But it's a huge change, and moving from all red numbers on boxes to actual things that say you can do this, but if you do this, that has a trade-off impact for what you can do over here will absolutely be something that I think about how do we work through that over the coming years together in a productive way that really shows that we're gonna put this money to good use in all the ways that we can. Thank you.
Chair.
Yeah, Councilmember Cedarberg, I
Thank
knew
you.
you
Now I
had
have a
something to say.
comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate this perspective, especially with a suburban edge rural district. The message is really clear. We're gonna be stewards of this, and those areas are gonna grow, and they're gonna need transit, and they will get transit. And there will be funds for transit to plan, and that's a really, really solid message that I can take to my communities. And so this is really, really timely as well. So thank you for putting this together, very easy to understand. But that 25-year horizon and stewardship and keeping track, it's like, well, will we ever see anything? Will there be any money left? Those are the questions that I hear. And I think, yes, there is money, there is stewardship, there are possibilities, and as we grow, things will happen.
And
So thank you.
this is important enough, it bears saying again, so I'm gonna say it again. And that is, we're not only covering a structural deficit, which were all those little red flags, we're doing something that no other system in this country is doing. And that is keeping this system in good repair.
Yep.
Now, you remember a number of years ago, we came into real kind of difficult, tough conversations when we tried to call the question of how do we fund capital maintenance? There was no funding source really identified. And and we were kind of there with our one funding partners, our counties, that were handling a lot of the operating costs. Well, state of good repair and capital maintenance is real responsibility, and it's real numbers. And if you get behind, and if you look at some of these legacy systems, I mean, I was just in New York, or even Washington DC, WMATA. There are stations that are closed in that robust metro system. There's escalators that don't work. And it's something you have to attend to every year. But having this 30-year forecast, and you can watch those cash balances, it's all about maintaining this as a quality system. So when people say, no, you have extra money, we'll worry about that later. No, now is the time when we have time to actually take that responsibility. And I think that's the talking point we all can carry to our constituents, to legislature and others, that we're not unique in spending a lot of money, we're unique in actually being fiscal stewards of that money going forward. And I really feel good about that. Councilmember Jones.
To Councilmember Cedarberg's point, and I'll maybe look at Councilmember Barber or Charles for an answer to those. So with that, we know, again, we saw what's in the pipeline and coming. And yet we have some lines out there that aren't really on a map yet, right? So in my neck of the world, it's maybe Highway 55 marching along, right? But it's not really there yet. And you've got some stuff out in your neck of the woods that you've got. So I don't know really how far out this money does go. I'm not telling anybody in my world yet that this is a done deal or with all this new money, Highway 55. I just won't do that because administrations change, go figure. Economies change. who knows what changes, right? People along the line could change their mind, who knows anymore, but I'm just trying to also be very cautiously careful and optimistic that this is good. If we didn't have this, nothing could be done. But I also wanna temper that just so that there aren't promises, you know, cause it's not you can see where we fall off and it goes down. And that's not really, if you look into the future of how we all live here at Met Council, that's not that far away. So that's how I'm couching it as well.
Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your comments about state of repair because having gone out and seen other transit systems, it is a profound issue for many areas and a concern when you talk to many of the operators or the managers of these systems of how they don't know how they're going to address it. The other thing is to some of the new lines, there are some funds within, that we may have with ours. We are going to continue to look for bonding money for AVRTs and some of those types of things. But also, I think it's very important to go back to the need for some of our local partners who have the money now freed up and are no longer responsible for operating costs and some of that, as well as having some of their own direct sales tax that can be used for some of these things for the actual building of things. Clearly, we are the operators, but we are looking to our local partners to help with that part. So I think there's longer term conversations to have with how that gets funded.
Great. All right, with that, next chapter.
Next chapter. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, council members. So now we'll walk through the draft policy is attached in the community materials, but we'll kind of walk through the major elements of it. So really this distills a few of there's many topics and priorities and objectives and actions and policies in the transportation policy plan that we kind of distill into 4 guiding principles here that are pretty consistent with the discussion we've had, as well as all of the past practices and priorities that we've used. Maintaining our transit assets in a state of good repair, sustaining our operations, both of the metro system and the region's bus system, expanding regional transit service across the region, both by the council and by other providers, and innovating and improving transit, including funding things that are required in state law. So the state had very specific requirements for some programs funded by this funding source. Obviously, we're delivering those and building upon those and innovating in other ways as well. To support this and to have this be a sustained revenue source, what the council would do through this policy is we would develop and maintain a long-range financial forecast where the policy identifies a minimum 25-year time horizon on that. So we looked at a 10-year chart that we've reported to the legislature. We'd be broadening that out to 25 years. We would be using target fund balances. So we had, based on future obligations, identify the funds we need to begin to save to meet those obligations long term. And use a target fund balance to set aside those funds for when those bills come due. We would specify sources and uses of sales tax funds and other funds in our operating and capital budgets. We'd also be consulting with regional transit providers, and probably not limited just to other providers, but to communities in the region for how we establish these investments. In terms of a forecast itself, we're identifying a 25-year time horizon as the target. We would be also updating this annually. So it would be a revolving 25-year forecast that we would use to guide the council's budget development. We would also be using this as the basis for allocation to transit providers in the region. So to the suburban transit providers, or as they're defined in law, replacement service municipalities, for those 12 communities and how they invest in their systems. We're not intending that it would be an annual allocation. We're intending that it would be a stable, reliable, and enduring allocation. It would revise periodically, and we define that in more detail. But it would be something they can count on year over year, not a revised every year process. So something that they can use to count on stable and reliable funding allocation as the funds are coming in. The policy sets an interim, that's a work in progress. That would build from the 25-year forecast that has not been fully developed. In the interim, to provide time for that to come together, this policy sets an interim allocation for those providers as we develop it. And we have a slide coming up that gets into that for the sales tax. This policy builds on the existing state transit funding allocation policy, and that's largely what's reflected in the left side here. That's as directed by law, then to light rail and commuter rail, then to regional bus and planning service for general fund appropriations. Motor vehicle sales tax currently is as directed by law, then state obligations not funded by general fund, then regional bus and planning services. So this is all existing policy. The new one is at the bottom. For Metro Mobility and Metro Move, which are transitioning to state forecast-based programs for the next fiscal year, what we're identifying here is that funds that the council receives for that program are isolated to that program. So it's a specific appropriation for that program that we're identifying in policy is restricted to that program. Pretty self-evident, pretty straightforward, but would be reflected that way in this policy. So this, right now we allocate 12.8% is the policy directed share. We share 4.3% of that with suburban transit providers. None of that changes with this policy, it's just continuing that practice of how we allocate and best funding. On the sales and use tax side of this, again.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, on that side, I'm sorry to interrupt me.
Yeah.
Thanks. Just a question, I just can't remember. Could you remind me, please, or remind us how long the MVAS and motor vehicle sales tax is authorized? Is there a time horizon on that?
No, Mr. Chair, Council Member, no time horizon. It's set. It's actually set in the state constitution in terms of its dedication to transit. And then the amount coming to the region is set in the statute.
I think I was president of the league at the time trying to stop the Civil War on that one.
It's unlike the legacy amendment and some of those others that have a time, which is why we think of that. This is part of the
That's good.
NBET allocation that was part
I
of
remember that.
also part of the constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
Oh, Wendy, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As long as we're on the slide talking about Metro Mobility, I'm really excited about it being part of the forecasted budget from the state. I mean, that's something we worked on for a long time. The new wrinkle that's come up though is kind of switching from regular route service to having more micro transit, that places end up losing their Metro Mobility federal service if too many, if people are taking the micro transit instead of the regular route and the regular route goes away. Are we gonna look at all at maybe working with the legislature so that the whole Metro Mobility region could all have the same level of service? We don't have that up and down for people and having that tension between regular route and micro transit. I mean, it should be the same. I mean, we're stuck with federal law that says something different, but there's nothing that says the legislature couldn't fully fund Metro Mobility so that everybody in the state area would get the full service.
Thank you for bringing that up, Councilmember Wolf. I'm gonna take a crack at that and then Charles can correct what I say. I think there is an opportunity for the legislature to set that same service standard throughout the region with Metro Mobility, throughout the Metro Mobility region. And there are two kind of zones, one that is state mandated, the other is federal mandated has a higher service standard. I think that the legislature could do that at a cost. So I think to the extent that we could identify what that cost is, and then it'll be up to the legislature, because they'd be spending general fund dollars forecasted funding. Charlie, you can correct me or add on to that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Councilmember, the difference is, there are differences between the two areas. There's a difference in how you reserve it, and there's a difference in that we are in the non-ADA area permitted to deny rides if needed for capacity. One way that we have bridged this difference is that we have built the capacity and ended trip denials in the non-ADA area. We haven't had one since January 2nd. Tried to make it December 31st, but very close. So we haven't denied trips this year. And we've met our performance goals. So folks are receiving a similar level of service. There is a difference in how you reserve it. That is a little bit trickier to solve, but how can we improve our service, and does the state want to make the investment to truly make it equal? And though everything is exactly the same, could be very expensive. To offer something that's pretty similar is actually something we've delivered as of this year.
Other than the
Other than how
ability
you
to make
reserve
the
it.
reservations,
Right.
yeah. I mean, it would be nice to know what would be the additional cost if everybody could have the nice reservation instead of the not
Standby.
nice.
Contingent, Yeah, and that came up in the legislative auditor's review, and I think it had captured the interest of some legislators.
I mean, Mr. Chair, in that hearing, we didn't have I wouldn't take this number to the bank, but we shared this number out loud that day to give a rough back of the estimate, during the hearing. It's for $50 million a year, you might be able to have that conversation and on top of what's currently there. And that it's one of those things where it both feels like a real number, but also feels pretty big when you think about the forecasted growth in the program. And so we were as clear, Charles did a great job of laying out the numbers for Metmo and what it would cost. And the legislature goes into this session at least being aware of some of those potential trade-offs as they're thinking what they want to do.
But Councilor Wolf, I think to your point, that number is kind of a rough estimate.
Right.
We don't want
It's not an
to
official.
represent that as the actual cost. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, if we aren't turning people down, is the expectation that if we weren't onerous in how you make the reservation, that there would be a lot more trips in the non-ADA area, or how does that number come about?
Charles?
Combination of really establishing a baseline capacity for a worst case scenario to ensure zero denials leads to a lot of capacity, and that's expensive. So that's one
Excess
side of it.
capacity.
Okay, so
If it's truly zero, and we probably could have come better prepared for a metro mobility conversation today, but happy to answer the questions we can answer. That's a piece of it. I think the other piece of it kind of points at what is the fundamental role of metro mobility and complementary paratransit service. It's to complement the bus system and the transit system generally. I think as we see microtransit coming in, actually one of the uses of microtransit and one of the benefits of microtransit is that a broader set of the population can use it, and it meets their needs, and it meets what they want it to accomplish, and it provides an on-demand way to do that. So to a certain extent, microtransit is actually providing an accessible transit solution that meets the needs of a lot of folks. That's how transit should function. Folks shouldn't have to rely solely on a paratransit complement to the transit system. Actually, the transit system should fulfill that function for as many people as it can. And in the case of microtransit, it can do that.
It will actually suspect it'll eat into the demand for paratransit.
Right.
But we don't know for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Well, that depends on why you're taking metro mobility. Like if you're really vulnerable, where you need to sort of be supervised while you're on the bus, then you need metro mobility rather than.
Yeah, not every trip purpose for absolutely.
And if you're going farther than the microtransit area and you have those challenges. So it will help for some people, but it also creates a lot of stress for the other people that no longer can just reserve because that regular route went away in favor of microtransit. So I mean, working our way around that and recognizing that microtransit is basically all-day transit, we should be not putting that extra stress on people who, for whatever reason, can't take micro.
But microtransit doesn't have a driver that'll walk you through the door.
Right. And I'm not saying necessarily that we would have to get to zero denials guaranteed for that whole area, but making it easier to reserve should not cost $50 million. But it would be a much more person-centered way of looking at it rather than treating it like the DMV.
Right. Do we have comments?
We talked about it before, but, you know, it's a little simplification to say that the microtransit is a direct replacement of
No, it's not.
No,
regular route.
I was,
Okay, just so
but
that
I- no.
nobody thought,
Mr.
that's
Chair.
where I received it, so maybe a little clarity.
No, what I was saying is in some places where transit ridership on regular route is low, if you replace it with microtransit, you can sometimes lose that regular route. And so the people that live where that regular route was lose their better.
They're out of the zone, but I think, does microtransit qualify as
No.
It does not. Okay.
No,
That-
that's the
your
whole,
point.
that's the whole point, it
That's your
should.
point. It should.
Because otherwise, you know, people who are relying on Metro Mobility, we had this big panic over the summer of people who got letters saying your zip code is gonna change. And it may have not changed for them, but somebody in their zip code might have changed, and it
Right.
puts a lot of stress on people.
Right. All right, any other questions? That was good conversation.
So the next piece gets into the sales and use tax allocation. So this would be for active transportation and for council uses. This is not very specific yet. There may be more specificity in the future, but really we're just kind of recognizing the 5% tab active transportation, 95% council transit uses split that's established in law, and then setting a interim allocation for the suburban providers, which I'll describe more in the next slide. So the suburban provider funding allocation for 2023 and 2024, we provided a interim allocation that was dispersed as a lump sum based on the estimated collections in the fourth quarter of 23 and for all of 2024. So the council approved that in a funding budget amendment, which then set the basis for dispersing those funds to the providers. That was completed in April of 2024 for this year and the end of last year. We would be continuing the basis of that funding, which was the share of regional ridership. In this case, for 2023, because of the reporting lag, it goes back 2 years. We would be allocating based on the share of regional transit ridership. That's about $17 million is what's estimated in terms of collections for 2025. What we would be doing with this allocation is actually transitioning to actual disbursements. So in 2024, it was paid out as a lump sum before we knew the total. There's actually a 3-month lag between when sales tax is collected and when we actually receive it. So we need to incorporate that lag at some point. So the option that we're advancing with this is that we transition to actuals. We've already paid the funds that the council would be dispersing in the first quarter of 2025. We paid that early this year. So that lag means that there'd be no disbursements in the first quarter of 2025, and that it would be continuing in perpetuity thereafter. What we're proposing is that, that's how we would implement that in discussion with the providers. For some, it created concern that, well, that means some of this money we're gonna get it's gonna be collected in 2025, but we're gonna receive it in 2026. That creates an issue for how we adopt our budget. Is there another option? The other option, and we're providing for that in the policy, is that the council could actually advance the funds so that they receive all of it in 2025. Their budget is kept whole in line with our guidance. What it means then is that transition to actuals hits in 2026. So there'd be a lag where that advance gets paid back in the first quarter of 2026. There'd be a true up, but it is an option that's provided for in this policy. So providers will have that option. We would be developing that with an agreement that would come for council approval and would provide that advance should folks want to take us up on it. One other piece of this interim policy is that under state law, the transit share of funding includes 13 items. Number 12 on that list of 13 is that the council can provide support to political subdivisions, so cities in this case, for active transportation. So the council may use a portion of the sales tax for active transportation use of the transit money. Plymouth and Maple Grove are interested in doing this, and as political subdivisions, they would be allowed to use this supplemental assistance for active transportation. So those two cities can use this funding for walking and pedestrian uses should they choose to. So that's allowed by law. The interim policy, what doing this interim policy for 2025 allows us to do is to continue discussion to develop a robust regional forecast and a policy basis that we would consider and adopt in the middle of next year that would take effect for 2026. So this would be across sources. This would allow us to consider other revisions in policy, other revisions in some of our business practices, that address both provider interests as well as the council's interests. So this could get into things like providing more formula funds to providers, and then instead of the council buying their buses, they buy their buses. May be of interest to some, may not be of interest to others. More time allows us to identify how that would work and to implement some of those changes and ultimately move forward with better systems across the region.
Right.
Mr. Chair, I'm just gonna add a couple of comments. I want to thank Councilmember Barber and Charles in particular for spending many hours in meetings and these conversations. Change is hard, not only internally, but with our other partners in the region too, who frankly would just, their ask has sort of been, how about don't change us while you go through change? And we've had to work on that some, and I understand it's anyone's rational first spot to often ask, is if you can take all the change and leave us the same, that's great. This last point about maybe you should own your stuff if we give you the money through. There is a part where the risk is borne in places different than who may own or operate the system right now, and that's problematic that we need to sort through, and there are different solutions to how to answer that. But the idea that we bear the risk for a service that we don't maybe operate or can have full control over seems problematic as well as we think about stewardship. So this is going to be a point of some level of potential friction next year. I just want to highlight that as we go through it. I think everyone's doing what they can. And then the part about the transition on funding. I don't know that, my feeling from the outside is there's not an easy way to do it. At some point you have to do it. Help us help you through what the easiest of those options are, but we live on the receipts collected, and we need the rest of our regional providers to also live on the receipts collected, so we're all tied to the same type of fair thing. But getting from one to the other, I really do appreciate the work that's gone in here by a few folks to give options, because there could be a world in which we just sent a letter, and that would not be a good way to go about it.
Councilmember Jones.
And thank you, Ryan, for that, and thank you, but I really wanna thank Charles and our team. We had a really good meeting in Plymouth on Monday, or virtually. So that hand wringing, not Maple Grove or Plymouth, it's just FYI. I really am pleased with the presentation you gave and the relationship we're building in Plymouth is my last meeting that I had, so it's not everybody. And I've also just asked my communities, cause they're great members of STA, STA is a great organization, but they are not always on the same page, but they are gonna be looking at how we calculate that formula for funding going forward. And I've just kindly asked if they hear of any legislative grumbling about, this at all, to keep us in the loop, just in case it catches wind of the legislature this year for any reason, so.
Yeah,
But I really am grateful, Charles, for all of your hard work, and Deb too for laying that foundation, because my cities are doing really cool things, and I think we have a great relationship going with them right now.
Great, thanks for that.
So the last piece of the policy relates to federal funding. And so as I mentioned before, we don't have anything in policy about this. We point at a business item from 2001. So this would set a policy that points at a business item from 2001 until we more fully develop this. So the council is the designated recipient of federal funding for transit in the region. We allocate funds to other providers. The changes from current practice are underlined in the left side of this. So we would be, the policy change that we're doing is we're isolating Metro Mobility and Metro Move formula earnings to that program. So the money that those services generate would be used only on that program. So that's a change in practice that, you know, has otherwise been pooled, but with the state forecast transition, it really needs to be isolated only for that purpose. So that's what we're doing with this
I
policy.
think we should highlight that, and I could, but Councilmember Barber, do you have any comments on this?
Sorry, I was multitasking, so say that again.
Is the use of federal funds prohibited for initial build out of government capital projects?
Sure, I think, you know, we've gone through the last couple of years with how we look at some of these big transitway projects and seeing the relief to local governments of taking the operations out of their responsibility, that is our fiscal responsibility. I mean, that money is coming to the region for distribution to the region to operate and rebuild the fleet and things like that, so it should be used for that.
Right, and I think also really important that we adopt a policy that ensures that we are prohibiting our funds to be used for the capital, for the local portion of these large capital projects. And
Amen.
you know, there are times we have had conversations in this room and in the chambers where we might want to look at, and other local governments have looked to us to cover some of those costs, and we do not have the capacity given everything else that we have taken.
Thank you, Chair, for that. I think, you know, this is a three-legged stool. You've got building it, operating it, maintaining it. We have two of those legs. I think it's fair to look to our local partners for the third one.
Thanks.
So next steps.
I love a picture of a bus in snow. I mean, it's just.
Is that from
Timely for
today?
the season. So to recap, you know, the part one policy is what we're considering. The part two is what would be ahead in the year to come. So part one, we're establishing the general principles and the method that we would use to capture that, a 25-year forecast, and et cetera. We're capturing state revisions for metro mobility, you know, both on the state side as well as the federal side. And then reflecting our current practices for how we allocate federal funds to providers, and then importantly, to set a baseline for sales and use tax. We're also including an interim allocation for the suburban provider cities. Part two is where a lot of the further work would occur, and really where a lot of the substance or change might happen as well. So that would come beginning with the results of a long-range forecast that the Part 1 policy is instructing us to develop that helps us set an ongoing allocation basis to providers that would, you know, may get into the, not just the ongoing sales tax allocation, but may get into how we work with them regarding our property levy that we collect in those communities, how we work with them on changes to the federal formula distribution, how that may translate to recipient relationships. You know, the council may not be the direct recipient of all dollars, will continue to be the designated recipient, but other providers may be able to receive these funds directly from the FTA as directed by the council. And then finally, the active transportation uses. So in-law political subdivisions are allowed to use these funds. That means Maple Grove and Plymouth may use it for active transportation. 10 other cities may also be interested, and so developing a mechanism that those 10 cities could use their transit dollars for active transportation could be an area of policy development. And then finally, we'd be developing some other requirements. So we must still operate a regional system, a system that interconnects in a seamless way. We'll get into requirements like fair collection standards. We'll get into you know, perhaps other requirements that right now are somewhat embedded in allowing use of fleet that we own. If we don't own that fleet, we have a few less levers. So we need to identify, you know, what are really the requirements for a seamless customer experience across the transit system, regardless of provider. So that's the kind of the final area of work that will tie into ongoing policy development. again, with the goal of adopting in the middle of 2025. There are updated economic forecasts that will influence this. The state legislative session ahead could influence this, and we want something that we can rely on for the purpose of developing a 2026 budget that we'd be developing, beginning the third quarter of 2025, and then, all of these changes perhaps becoming effective then for that 2026 budget. So that sets out our timeline ahead. Part one of this, of course, is adopting this policy. So this part one, the information overview today, and then next week, beginning at Transportation Committee, with the Stop at Management Committee, and then to the council on December 11th. Interested folks in the public could address the council members at the November meeting or the December management meeting. But this is really the kind of the timeline of council's steps and toward adopting part one, and then that really would kick off the development of part two for next year. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer further questions from the council, or certainly welcome your discussion.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with suburban providers considering potentially being direct recipients, and I think some are already going into studies or whatever to figure out what the expense and the scope and responsibilities would be. Let's say one or more go and move forward with that, and then at some point in the future, maybe they decide this probably wasn't our best option, or something else comes their way where they're like, gosh, this is a big responsibility, and maybe there are just some difficulties or compliance issues that pop up. Would it be wise to have some sort of policy that indicates if a scenario, whatever, unfolds and they want to come back and under our role of being the direct recipient, that we'd have some criteria or something before we would accept them back? Or I just think it's a big deal, and I know some of our, I don't think my communities are gonna do this, because kind of right out of the gate, they're like, ooh, no, you keep doing that. But if others wanna move forward and do it, that's their choice. But I just know that even with us being the one who reports to the feds, we've gotta get all that information from them, and I know they're very busy people, but it's not always been easy. So it'll be on them, and that's great. I just think that if we've got a policy, what happens if somebody wants to come back, and how do we manage that?
So, Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that it would be extraordinarily hard to roll back to being, go from direct recipient to under us. I think that it's sort of, once this is done, it becomes you set up the reporting structure, we're talking about who owns the assets, who owns the debt, just shifting all of those sorts of things. It's complicated to change from being a direct recipient. It would be much harder, I think, to roll it back. So that's why we have to take the time with this.
Yes.
And we've had a lot of meetings with the suburban transit providers. We've talked with them at length about what some of this means, what it doesn't mean. We were at the autonomous car launch for Southwest Transit, I think a couple weeks ago, and they were very thankful, not only for regional solicitation money, but because we wrote and managed the grant work with the federal government for that money. So it's like you start shifting those responsibilities, and then you say, oh, we changed our mind, we're gonna come back. So we gotta be very thoughtful, and if we're doing it, do it right. And then if it becomes something that is not tenable, then know that before we actually make the change.
And Mr. Chair, that's my point, just simply that everybody go in with eyes wide open at whatever part of this process you're at, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation or they find themselves in a situation, because we want success, we want to be good partners. But I think the eyes wide open thing and the magnitude of what that decision means, and I'm glad Deb is leading the charge and helping, and Charles, because I don't have that, I don't have that with mine, but I just know that when I heard about it and I understood the gravity, and I was just kind of listening to my communities, I'm like, okay, good. It's their choice, but it's a lot of responsibility and transition. And I just know that sometimes people go, having been a suburban mayor, well, we can do things on our own, maybe, but I just think taking things back are, we should set expectations.
I think it does flesh out a aligning responsibility, funding, ownership, and I think that is a direction we embrace. And but it is a threshold question. It kind of hard to have it both ways, which is kind of this murky world we're living in now. So we need to kind of get that sorted out. Councilmember Bento, you had your hand.
Probably not what anybody wants to think about tonight, but when I can't sleep at night, I go to my phone and make the mistake of making it even harder to sleep at night. And lately I've been looking up potential leaders of federal departments and also what is predicted in terms of a future direction. And what I've read about the future of transportation at the federal level isn't pretty. The same is true in terms of housing, and I would ask that if it's possible, either, I doubt it's possible between now and the end of December, but perhaps early in 2025, to get a federal legislative update on all areas of our council responsibility and what we can expect, so.
Yeah, well, and you are not alone in that, thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Councilmember, I appreciate that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And obviously there's lots of like speculation going on right now too. And at some level, the speculation can almost be harmful at too much of a degree. So I appreciate the patience of like, well, as the new administration makes more clear in official policy, not innuendo or social media side speculation, like we'll bring that in. I think the one other thing I'd just add is in conversations with staff in various town halls and stuff, there's the part of reminding ourselves too to control what we can control at home and make sure that we are doing the best that we can to provide service to a region that needs it in all sorts of times. And this policy, the sales tax, the opportunity for this council to help be stewards of it actually really signifies hopefully a part of what can help you sleep a little bit at one of those moments, because it reminds us of all the things that we can do. There's no doubt that there are still federal funds built into this. I think it was 13% or 19%, somewhere in there, around 15%. That is a material amount of money, and that has implications on what we can do. And then if you look at future build, there's material amounts of money that could impact what could happen or not happen. So we'll think about that alongside it, but in the short term, one of the biggest things we're doing as we do those evaluations is, as a group across the entire council, areas well beyond transit, reminding ourselves of what is it that we do every day and need to continue to do, because we know that people need to see government working around them.
Mr. Chair, if I could,
Yeah.
I don't disagree at all with what you said, Ryan, but my only point is, as a planning organization, I think we have a responsibility to kind of know what could be coming at us. And there have been lots of pretty strong hints being given, and I don't do social media per se. I'm reading stuff I probably shouldn't read at night, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, trust me. But I just think we have to have it on our radar so that it doesn't come at us as a bolt of lightning. And I know our legislative staff is way more insightful than we give them credit for. So I don't mean to try and tell Judd and Hannah and folks who represent us in Washington what to do or how to do it, but I would just appreciate knowing.
Yeah. Councilmember.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate Ryan's point of we can control what we can control, because we've got 2 transportation committee meetings left this year that we're gonna have to make some pretty significant votes that do involve some federal funding sources. But we don't know, I mean, we can prognosticate and say this and that's going to happen, all of this. But we're gonna have to advance some things with a little bit of unknowns and then reset when they become known. So I just wanna, I know it's uneasy and troubling, but it's sort of the reality for the next couple of months.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts?
Charles, could you just briefly mention, so a lot of this policy is built around lessons from the past and new things that have come our way. But I also know that we thought about prospective, like what happens someday when a new source of funding happens? How does this policy anticipate that?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, council members, and I think it could be positive, it could be negative, but that's why we're proposing that we would update this forecast on an annual basis.
Right.
So that we can capture changes along the way So if there is new or unexpected funding, we can update the forecast and accomplish it that way. One other piece that we address this is actually there is a short provision in the policy about what happens if other funding comes to the council. And for that, we recognize we may receive additional funding, and effectively what we say is we'd use that as directed by law. If we get unexpected funding, it probably has some kind of string or intended purpose attached for it, and we would use that, as that source dictates, or as guided by this or other policies, including, we have council sources of revenue policy that would also be instructive for how we might use a funding source.
And I think, just to kind of echo a lot what you've just heard tonight, this is more than an exercise of spreadsheets, although there was a lot of that. This is really thoughtful policy considerations, and you see the calendar of actions. We're gonna have opportunities for more deliberation at the committee level, but we will be coming together here as a full council to take some actions on December 11th. And these are really important. They're really setting the foundation. There's still more work to do. But I think the good news, and what I take from this, is not only the opportunity to be transparent, provide a kind of a framework for our fiduciary role, but never in the history of Met Council have we had as many capital projects underway. We've had so many hiring and openings on the near horizon. And all that is currently funded. And yes, we have some vulnerability from federal formula funds, maybe some capital funds. We'll see, but I think we now have a more diversified portfolio of revenue coming from different sources than that has ever existed before. So this is really a good place to be right now, despite the mystery of what might happen next year, we never know. But I really think we've been put in good shape and be prepared. Thank you, Charles, and Councilmember Bauer, your committee. We're ready to take this vote, and almost importantly, this was in a way not a dry run, a first run of a lot of different presentations we're going to be making, both externally to our the legislature, but also to other stakeholders. And you'll be hearing kind of versions of this presentation a number of times, and I think each of us as ambassadors will be helping give those presentations in the future. So, with that, any other questions? Councilmember Barbara.
I will be very brief.
Last word.
Yes, thank you. So going back to the we control what we can control. So you can see there's a transportation committee meeting on November 25th. I will say the agenda is profound. So I really need everyone to show up. I think that we've got 2 more meetings before the end of the year. So if you cannot make it, please let somebody know as soon as possible. Thank you.
Anything, Mr. Arias?
Mr. Chair, I believe the E-line will be done by noon tomorrow. The construction will be wrapped up. And we've been doing daily situation reports. It's been a rough, the weather didn't play well at the very end, but we've been doing this as we go. And we could have used a few hours of less rain this afternoon. I was kind of cursing that, but we're very close. And the sit rep says done by noon tomorrow.
It's delayed now another 4 hours, but I think it's gonna get done.
So close.
All right. In Edina. All right, for those who are not living in Edina but want to get home, this was a good meeting. It is snowy, but that was a great conversation, a great presentation. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, all your people. And this meeting is adjourned.